I would like now to introduce you to today's presenter, Mr. Julian Wilson. He has the title Sector Manager, Inspection with NATA. Julian holds a Bachelor of Science Technology degree in Metallurgy from the University of New South Wales, a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors, postgraduate qualifications in Islamic Studies, and a master's degree in Management and Economics. His economics master's thesis focused on conformity assessment, industry structure, and trade. Julian started with NATA in 1994 in their laboratory accreditation program. Since 2001, Julian has managed NATA's inspection accreditation program. So over to you, Julian, and if you could please turn on your microphone and webcam.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Sam, for organising it. Thank you, attendees, for coming along and listening to me. Next slide, please, Sam. I've been asked to talk a little bit about NATA to provide some background to what NATA does, and then to provide a bit more value add if I could. So I've got 42 slides. Goodness gracious, 42 slides and 40 minutes. We'll see how we go. Before I go there, however, next slide, please, Sam, I'd really like to talk about the concepts of conformity assessment, because conformity assessment is the modern way, the modern terminology for answering the question, is it good enough? And that's been applied across so many areas of our modern life. When you go into the shops, you ask yourself the question, is this good enough? When you're looking at something happening in the environment, you're asking, is this good enough? When a doctor takes a blood sample and sends it out for analysis, or when a hygienist gets a sample taken, the question is diagnostic, but it's comparison with a baseline. The question is it good enough? Conformity assessment is described in a set of modalities. And as we have long supply chains these days and complex product, it's only appropriate that these concept builds a better understanding, builds a structure within which we are able to say at the end of that supply chain with a complex product, yes, this is good enough. Now there's an ISO IEC series of standards, the 17,000 series of standards that deal with this. If you think about it, almost all of the testing and the inspection you do is really intended to answer the question, is it good enough? Next slide, please, Sam. So the conformity assessment modalities are listed in this table. I'm not going to go through it in huge detail. SDOC is the supplier's declaration of conformity. So you're relying upon the supplier to say, yes, this is good enough. And that might seem to be a pretty weak process, accepting that we use it all the time. I went down to the shops the other day and bought myself a set of AAA batteries. Now, they're a fairly sophisticated product. There's a lot of chemicals inside them. They are millimetre precise in length and thickness. I don't get out a vernier caliper and measure them. I don't get out an electrical device and measure the voltages. I take it as printed by the supplier's declaration. This is a AAA battery. It will fit into my machine. Only once in 50 odd years do I remember any set of AAA batteries not fitting into a AAA battery holder. The supplier's declaration of conformity works, basically. There are other modalities: testing, system certification, personnel certification, product certification, and inspection. Now, the choice between those modalities depends upon what the focus of the assurance is, and it depends upon the fit and the risk between this. If you're buying batteries to fit into a Christmas present or a birthday present, then you'll take the supplier's declaration. If you're buying batteries to fit into life jackets or to fit into an essential service necessary to perform on demand, then you'll spend a bit more time. You might take some samples, you might do some batching, you might do some additional testing, you might inspect the production facilities, you might establish some form of product certification around just that battery, just that supply, just that purchase order, depending upon your risk profile and the product that you're trying to pick. But all of these are really about answering the question, is it good enough, and providing assurance down the supply chain or through the information flow that the results are reliable. If I finish now and you've understood that, then I've had a win. Are there any questions about that, please? Next slide. Thanks, Sam. Not hearing that there are any questions, so we might move on. Very good. Thank you. So we've got the modalities, we've got the concept of conformity assessment. In the context of Australia, purchases are coming from a structure of the policy, the regulations, the contracts. The measurement system is handled by the National Measurement Institute. They're the people who say that the meter is NATA. And then your purchase order calls up a series of documentary standards and methods published by Standards Australia or published by other entities. I know AIOH, for instance, has a range of guidance and material that is particularly useful in terms of this particular industry. Next slide, thanks, Sam. The modalities come in here at the point of the claims of conformity, the claims of verification, the claims that this material supplied in the fulfillment of the order or the regulation is in fact good enough. And then, because those modalities are open to mystery, they are, there's an economic term which has slipped out of my mind for exactly the moment. They're not easily assured outside of the claim that's made. And so therefore, NATA and JASANS have been created to provide assurance about those modalities. NATA supports the testing and inspection activities, and JASANS is supporting the certification, verification, and some inspection activities. And the intention of those is to provide technical outcomes, to underpin the technical outcomes so that society can make informed decisions. That's the basis of the story for NATA. But I want to go further into that. I want to expand and look at a little bit about what is NATA accreditation and how it works, and then perhaps turn to some of the other things. Before we do that, and just to get you involved, a little bit of a survey. How are you involved with NATA? I've picked out a couple of dot points there. Are you employed or engaged in an accredited facility? Are you involved in ordering tests or calibrations or other related activities? Do you have to perhaps work with the outcomes of testing to understand what they mean in your particular circumstances? Maybe you haven't encountered NATA before, and so quite possibly, who's NATA is a reasonable answer. So I can see some votes coming in now. Oh wow, 3/4 of you have put the answers in. No one has said who's NATA, and I no dare say as soon as I've said that, someone will. No one has said who's NATA, but it's roughly evenly split between working with outcomes and ordering calibrations, about 15 each there, and then a small number, half that, are employed or engaged in supporting an accredited facility. Good. Thank you. That's a useful indication. Yes, we get one who's NATA. Thanks, guys. So, what is NATA accreditation? Well, accreditation has a formal definition in the ISO 17000 series of standards. It's a procedure by which an authoritative body gives formal recognition that a body is competent to carry out specific tasks. There is a confusion in the words in common language here. Quite often you'll hear the word certification used, and certification is a third-party attestation relating to products, systems, or persons. So a certification is a statement about the conformity. Accreditation is recognition that the body is competent to perform the conformity assessment tasks. 2 levels. So if you think about it, an entity may well be certified as operating to ISO 9001, and the certification body that issues that certificate is itself accredited for working to 17021. The manufacturer is actually forbidden from issuing a clear assurance of quality based upon the ISO 9001 certification. There are very strict rules about what they can and cannot do with that certification. A laboratory inspection body issues a report. It makes a statement about the conformity, and therefore it has to be accredited. So that's why there's the 2 levels that appears. You often get some confusion about the outcome documents, the difference between a certification and an accreditation, but it's quite clear when you think about what does this document state, what does it say? So NATA was created in 1946. It was a joint Commonwealth, state and industry construct. It was the continuation of the Second World War approved test house scheme, and it was set up as a national interest entity. We would contend that we are authoritative because we have both a domestic recognition through our MOUs with state and Commonwealth governments and international recognition through mutual recognition agreements. We assess the competence of laboratories and inspection bodies through a process of peer assessment, and the specific tasks are identified in what we call a scope of accreditation, which identifies what test methods, what testing techniques, what inspection activities, what inspection standards and methods are brought to the table. Why are we doing this? The intention of this is to support sound decision making. We facilitate the availability of reliable data. If you see evidence or database decision making as important, then the quality or reliability of that data is important. And that's where NATA accreditation can come in. Next slide, Sam. Now, I hate slides with lots and lots of text, but sometimes you just have to do it. So this is a cut from our existing objectives from our rules, and I've highlighted out the bits that really resonate for me. Now, when I'm feeling down about the organisation because it's a complex bureaucracy, this information, this set of objectives really serves to me as a motivator for why I do what I do. I'm not going to read through it completely, but if you look through A through F, you'll see that we're all about promoting the quality of testing and inspection, to support national interest, to work for the benefit of Australia and for trade, to provide accreditation services to facilitate international trade, to promote engagement and participation, and to support international recognition of Australian product and reports. So there's both an international and a domestic component in what we do. Next slide, thanks. Since we started in laboratory recognition in 1946-47, we've grown tremendously. We've taken on additional work. We've taken on additional standards. You can see on that slide the range of accreditation programs and the current accreditation criteria that we're applying to the entities. We have now about 3,000 accredited entities, split about 1,600 for our medical lab pathology group, about 1,500 for our laboratories, and about 200 for our inspection bodies. Reference materials and PT are very small, about 2 dozen in each of them, and the sleep disorders and medical imaging set are also quite small. Sleep disorders was only recently started up and appears to have hit some issues when you start talking about COVID and access to sleep. Next slide, thanks. How do we do what we do? Well, I highlighted earlier about specific activities. We ask the facility to identify what it wants accreditation for. The facility chooses what it wants accreditation for. NATA is not a regulator. We don't have regulatory powers. We don't have controlling powers over laboratories. We don't have controlling powers over laboratories that are not accredited. You can't operate a laboratory and say, oh, well, that's got to be NATA accredited. just by the virtue that it exists, a contract or regulation needs to push the laboratory into the accreditation domain. For the facility providers, there is a cost, and therefore they have to make a business decision as to whether there is a market for that particular set of activities that can justify the cost associated with gaining and holding the accreditation. So it's not a clear everything you do, and it's not oh, there's an Australian standard, therefore there must be an accredited laboratory. The laboratories have got to see that that acts as a useful adjunct to the services they provide. We use accreditation criteria, and I identified on a previous slide the standards that were being used. All of those criteria cover staff, equipment, the methods used, the environment in which the work is done, how records, reports, and the supporting infrastructure system supports the realization of those activities. Accreditation criteria ensure equivalence in the marketplace. It may well be that a small entity and a large entity are both competing. These criteria ensure that the same requirements for staff, for equipment, for the environment are applied to both entities. This is intended to provide a level playing field for a commercially available product. We use peers in this work, and no doubt several of you in the group are technical assessors and so on. They're drawn from the accredited facilities, from the universities, from the regulators, from other stakeholders. We match the expertise of those peers to the expertise for the facility being assessed so that a reasonable, technically relevant assessment is performed. Next slide, thanks. The accreditation involves ongoing work. This is not a once-off, it's not a registration or a listing. It involves NATA bringing a team back periodically to establish that the facility that's accredited continues to operate as intended. Things change. Management moves on, new ideas come out, new systems are established. We need to assess periodically to establish that these are continuing to operate as intended. We have the ability to apply sanctions. We don't advertise that publicly in a listing, but I can tell you that between 2 and 5% of accredited facilities are subjected to some level of sanction at any one time. Those sanctions include shortened surveillance intervals, the possibility of suspension, and in the most egregious cases, the possibility of cancellation of their accreditations. The intention is this gives confidence to the marketplace while maintaining a level of privacy around the findings that are necessarily there. The focus of accreditation is upon demonstrated, practical, collective competence. Next slide, thanks. So there is a process for gaining the accreditation. This is the upstream end where an inquiry comes to us. We would typically provide an advisory visit where we identify and negotiate what is in scope, what are the consequences of things being in scope, what is the process downstream. So there's quite a bit of information exchange at that advisory visit. We don't perform any assessment at that, and we're not providing any feedback that prejudges what might be found at the assessment process, but we certainly can say this activity needs to be performed in a clean environment. This activity has to be performed. You know, there's enough common sense materials that you can rule out the worst of the tire kickers. We ask for a formal application, and then we ask for documentation to be provided to support the realisation of the negotiated prospective scope. Next slide. We then establish an on-site peer assessment. We have about 6,000 technical assessors on our books, and we're therefore in a position usually to be able to identify a person whose skills overlap with the scope that's been requested. We go to site, and it's grown-up show and tell. We have findings that come from that, and we present a report. That report identifies deficiencies that need to be addressed. Look, In 10% of the cases, we would say we would need to come back. The rest of the time, it's usually pieces of paper. It's correcting pagination or correcting, including additional sentences in a procedure or providing records to demonstrate that a system is actually operative. That response is reviewed by the team, and we then assemble a recommendation to grant the accreditation. Next slide. For laboratories, if there is proficiency testing available, we require the laboratories to participate in that proficiency testing, and that gives additional confidence that the performance of the laboratory is consistent with the performance of peers in the same marketplace. At 18 months, we will provide a surveillance, further proficiency testing, and every 3 years we do a full reassessment. So the surveillance is intended as a mini assessment targeted to either vertical or particular elements of the process, typically picking up on findings derived from the previous assessment activity. I'm told there's a few questions coming in, so I might just have a look at that and see what we can see. Wow, questions all over the place. How does market feel confidence in the NATA sanction process if it's not an advertised NATA function? We make it clear that we take the activity. We have a list of entities that are cancelled, and that list is refreshed after a very short period of time, typically only a matter of months. And for suspensions, it's publicly available on our website when you go looking. But it's not a very, it's certainly not a high-profile thing that we're involved in. Is there a fee for the advisory service? Yes, there is. There's an hourly rate fee for the advisory visit. Is there an appeal process if an accredited laboratory is sanctioned? Yes, definitely. And the appeal process is handled by other people within NATA and other technical people than those involved in the process to that point. The intention is that it is quite clear and that there is a very good chance to provide procedural and administrative justice. So does accreditation work? Well, this graph is a graph for one fairly large entity. There's 3 sites involved in the data here. The y-axis is the number of non-conformances identified by assessment teams at a visit. You can see little checkpoints in the blue squiggly line. We start off, my magnification is not fabulous, but we start off at slightly under 25. I think it was 24 non-conformances at the first visit. And as we work through the visits, the number of non-conformances drops dramatically. Now, some of these will be simple issues that are fixed once and gone away. Others of them will be responding to systems that have been established or asking for additional checks and balances to be put into the system. You can see that the number of non-conformances bounces around the 5 mark until it stabilizes about 3/4 of the way through that graph. There's several visits involved here, and about halfway through the graph you can see a point on the x-axis marked AS, and that was when the 3rd site was assessed. Again, you can see that there's been some reflection of the learning curve there, but you can also see that it's at the upper level of what you would accept in terms of that learning curve. About 3/4 of the way through, things stabilize out, and we're at about 4 non-conformances per visit, and then something changes. And I can tell you exactly what it was that changes. The then quality manager, who was corporate quality manager, got a promotion and is now currently quality director Asia Pacific, and a new incumbent comes in. And that new incumbent brings new ideas and new systems, replaces some old systems, and the number of non-conformances bounces around while those things are being identified and implemented. What will happen in the future? I don't know. I suspect that they will regain control and pull the number of non-conformances down. But while there are changes occurring in that organisation, there are some additional findings associated from assessment. Next slide, thanks. What accreditation can and can't do. I think at this point it's probably appropriate that I do talk about what we do and what we cannot do, because there's a number of misconceptions in the public about what accreditation does. We do assess the competency of the facility to undertake activities under their scope. We do not approve methods or privilege one technical solution over an equivalent. So if there are a mixture of Australian standards and ISO standards and Chinese standards, we're not going to turn around and say, no, you can't hold accreditation to those. We're celebrating or recognising just this one. That determination is by the facility, and it's based upon its commercial testing activities, its commercial inspection activities, and how those are serviced and what their clients are demanding. We're not the gatekeeper on which standard is privileged. We no longer approve staff. Long ago and far away, we were recognising people as approved signatories. It's been over a decade since we stopped doing that, but some of the old timers still think that NATA is approving staff and assessing competence in such a way that only approved people can sign. That's no longer the case. We still assess competence. We still determine that staff selection and staff training work so that we have confidence in the results being provided, but it's for the laboratory or the inspection body to approve staff and to authorise them to do different things within the facility. We do assess governance structures and systems, but it's really, really hard during an assessment to identify fraud and deceptive conduct. We often find things that suggest fraud, but most of the time when we're involved in a fraud investigation, it's because somebody has brought it to us. They've suggested that a laboratory is dodgy or that there's an inconsistency, and we're then in a position to very, very much target. If you're facing a filing cabinet full of results, it is very hard to find just the one or two that might have been fraudulently altered. It's a sampling challenge. We can't ensure all work's performed to the standard. We do review by sampling, and the instructions that are issued to my staff are to look at a statistically significant number of reports based upon the reports issued since we were last there. Now, that's a pretty tall ask when you're talking about entities which are issuing tens of thousands of results in a year. It's what people would expect. So there's a balance here in terms of how much do you do, statistically significant, unless you can have a very good reason for it being other than that. LIMS are fabulous these days because there is direct data entry, there is direct capture, and therefore there's a higher degree of confidence that the numbers are in properly. There are other problems with LIMS, and I'm sure people who've been watching conformity assessment internationally would be aware of those. So you need only say Kobe Steel, and it's people run from the room. But yeah, it's very difficult to readily identify fraud, and it's very difficult to ensure that all work's performed to a standard. We don't consult, and we don't reveal deficiencies. We will identify deficiencies, and it's for that facility to address them. We do discipline facilities, but we cannot regulate or require all labs to be accredited. There's a thought out there that we are the authority, we are the regulator for labs. We're not, and we cannot require all laboratories to be accredited. We do investigate complaints, but we cannot go beyond the scope of accreditation. We do support technical infrastructure. I'm actually personally active in, I think, 15 standards committees, and NATA continues that across the industry. We try very hard not to create our own world of requirements, and we've backed away from that very much over the the last 15 years. Most of the documents that were strongly supported as you shall are now guidance, because it's for the facility to work out its needs in the context of the work that it's doing. Next slide, thanks, Sam. So, what are the advantages in using accreditation? I think the key one is that this provides support to specifiers. The facility has demonstrated competence to its peers in that scope of accreditation. So that means if you are specifying or writing out seeking tenders for conformity assessment activities, the amount of pre-qualification effort can be reduced. If you're a market maker, and I'm dealing with a couple of industry associations who are trying to create a market where a range of accredited providers compete competitively to service that market, accreditation is one way of establishing that there's a consistency across those providers. It also offers both specifiers and market makers a complaint escalation pathway if needed. For the facilities, if the facility is small or in a specialist area, the fact that you get a peer assessment, equivalent expertise coming to talk to you about that specific activity periodically, is a fabulous way of being held to account by your peers, but also to go through a professional exchange, a targeted technical, robust technical discussion, which will cover all of the facets that impact the reliability of the work being done. It does give you the chance to benchmark against standards, and potentially accreditation will be required for you to access some contracts and comply with some regulations. So there's a range of reasons why you might choose to look at the accreditation. Next slide. Questions. Are there any? What if a customer thinks the lab is either offering or competing tests is not accredited? Do you investigate complaints or dodgy labs? We do if they are accredited. If they're not accredited, then we have no authority to get involved. We have no power to get involved. So there's a very clear line between the accredited laboratories and the testing that might be provided otherwise in the marketplace. If you think back to the modalities and the graph I showed, the table I showed earlier, choosing between those modalities and choosing to use an accredited facility is really how much do you need that data to be reliable. I know that sounds really sad, and predecessors of mine would have said, no, you should be using accredited all the way. But I think we have to recognize that it's a marketplace, and sometimes specifiers will choose not to use accreditation at their own risk.
Julian?
Yes, John.
Can I just ask you a question as well? Now, you mentioned before that about 2 to 5% non-compliant at any given time. So the question basically is, what percentage has their accreditation cancelled?
Cancellations are relatively rare. We would typically be dealing with under a dozen a year. We have to have absolute evidence that there is egregious activity that cannot be addressed and leave us with confidence that the accreditation is valid. So it's a last ditch activity. Quite often, entities will find themselves in a spot where life's uncomfortable. You know, they're moving. Certain services can't be acquired. They can choose to suspend. We do suspend as well if we find wholesale difficulties, and typically that would be an entire system. Personnel have all left the organisation. There's nobody left who understands how this series of tests or inspections actually should be done. They're recruiting for new people, but there'll be a 6-month to 12-month gap while they find and go through the processes. We'll suspend them. And that happens quite often. If it's not a critical issue, you can see some suspensions last for up to 12 months. But cancellations usually reserved for the most egregious, usually lying and deceptive conduct, falsification of findings. We deal with quite a bit there, John.
Thank you.
Question: have we had experience of NATA accreditation carrying weight in litigation? And I think that means court cases, Michael. Yes, NATA's got a significant amount of involvement in that area. There seem to be a number of pathways into court cases, and most of the forensic laboratories and police forensic activities, scene of crime officers, are accredited, and NATA supports that activity and provides support to the various court processes that to inform the value of that accreditation and what it's actually achieving. There are also some accredited facilities which are providing testing, which is then called up into court cases, and we have, in fact, a module that supports chain of traceability of evidence and so on, to be able to provide additional confidence that the evidence that's going to be used has not been tampered with outside the testing activity. Hopefully that's involved. NATA itself has not been involved that often in court cases, but what usually happens is that the laboratory will present its scope of accreditation and its findings as evidence that this particular information is to be trusted and weighted appropriately. Another question: does it happen often that a laboratory will falsely represent itself as NATA accredited? I'm going to answer that in two halves. On the domestic side, usually not. Not a common thing that I'm aware of in the domestic domain. Internationally, however, yeah, there are crop, chop and paste shops overseas where where reports can be created and logos stuck on as appropriate. We've found a number of cases where you can dial up whatever you want on an overseas report and work from there. What I would be saying, and I will talk about that later on, is if you have a report in your hand, it's not a St. Christopher's. It's up to you to accept that report, and it's up to you to do enough to be able to be confident that the report is a valid, meaningful report. It's not there as a device that turns away all wrath and everything's rosy. You as the user, you as the consumer of those reports, have to ask some reasonable questions as to whether it is appropriate to you. Later on in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about that. How does the average punter assure themselves that the lab is currently accredited for the process, say analytical testing that's required? As Alan has said, you can check the lab scope of accreditation on our website. That scope of accreditation on the website is updated daily, and you can punch in either the laboratory accreditation number, or you can punch in a standard to find out who else is accredited for that particular set of tests. Moving on, please. I've picked out a few areas of relevance that might be useful to occupational hygienists. Probably the one that is most at the top of the page is the assessment of hazardous materials, the identification of asbestos-containing materials, survey of buildings and sites, and the witnessing of the decontamination and the assessment of the decontaminated premises. There are a number of accreditations in that domain, both in the testing identification side and the inspection survey side. Of some relevance today is the PPE, personal protective equipment. There are a range of laboratories accredited for approvals testing. We are involved in accrediting entities for assessment for slips and trips and the workplace environment. We have a number of laboratories accredited for tests on human fluids, both for heavy metals and other nasties, as well as the usual the usual fluids that you'd be looking for medical pharmaceutical processes. There's a range of workplace drug testing, both the sampling and the analysis of human fluids again. We've accredited entities for calibration of a range of measuring equipment and for the proficiency testing for asbestos and other materials, and the creation of reference materials, including certified gases for testing gas detectors and devices like that. There's a broad range of areas of relevance for occupational hygiene. There are some emerging issues. Next slide, thanks, Sam. Probably top of the pops for us at the moment is the fate of this Australian standard for the identification of asbestos. We are receiving regular requests for methods for specific media. Just recently, we've had a request for identification of asbestos in water. A little odd, but clearly there's some commercial need, some concern, and the standard itself is not that helpful in this. The standard at the moment is dealing just with polarized light microscopy. It's 16 years old. It's time it was expanded to include some of the other techniques that are commonly used. Our concern with this standard is that the framework that standard is set up on is the management of legacy contamination drawn from Australian manufacture. That's where we were in 2004. In 2020, we're now facing a second wave, if you like, of issues relating to contamination on materials newly constructed and being imported. So the assumptions that went into the 2004 document about the types of asbestos that would be present and where it would be present are no longer relevant in 2020. We're looking to update this standard to provide a more robust, modern document that supports the Australian need for asbestos identification. The West Australian guidelines relating to asbestos in soils are also under review, and I believe there's been some commentary both from NATA and from AIOH in that matter. We're watching with concern the emergence and management of silica and silica dusts. It would seem that neither industry nor regulators have seen that it is possibly the next asbestos. We are starting to see a number of inquiries about methamphetamine in residential properties, particularly relating to sampling and testing, but also considering whether remediation has been satisfactorily completed. I'm not sure where that will go. I know that New Zealand had an adventure with methamphetamine and developed their own standard, but have to see how that goes. Those are the current issues that we're seeing in this particular domain. Next slide, thanks. It's also probably appropriate for me to talk a little bit about what NATA's done in response to COVID-19. It's been interesting. We've seen a changed demand. There is a huge demand for testing on PPE coming through. Many of the testing labs that we thought would be impacted by closure or reduced testing have actually gone the other way, that because sites are not as occupied, there's been an increase in the amount of testing. It's my understanding that some asbestos survey and identification places are going absolutely flat chat at the moment because the human occupancy is reduced. We've introduced a pro bono, so no charge for variations to human path labs that are seeking accreditation for COVID testing, and many laboratories have taken us up on that. We have expedited assessments for personal protective equipment and COVID-related laboratories, and for those facilities, we're now seeing turnaround from things addressed to decision-making within timeframes which are traditionally extraordinary. We've less than a quarter of the typical average time, median time is happening on these activities. We've conducted remote assessments for those laboratories that are doing COVID testing on FIFO workers. There's a couple of commercial entities that are still using fly in, fly out, and they need accredited testing to proceed with confidence, and we've managed to set up remote assessments there. We've also introduced, recognising that accreditation is only a means of providing assurance, we've introduced a method-focused recognition for temporary laboratories. Now, this is in anticipation that there may be temporary laboratories needed to support assurance of testing. These facilities may only be operating for a matter of months, a season at most, and so we've developed a method-focused recognition here, which tries to fill in the gap between trust me, I'm a laboratory, and the full-blown accreditation. So there's room there for a more nuanced approach from the government, and the ability for the government to accept some of these activities, confident that the results are reliable. For those of you operating an in-office laboratory, for those of you operating a laboratory, we've now moved to an in-office assessment. The physical contact of the traditional assessments has stopped while the COVID crisis is working its way through, and we're anticipating a gradual return to physical presence assessments as we move on. Next slide, thanks, Sam. The other thing that's emerged is, this has really revealed a couple of gaps in our testing capability. There are gaps in the expectation in PPE, particularly between the specification in the Australian standard and the accredited testing capability to meet that standard. And there's been a significant amount of work trying to bridge that gap. There were some tests which were, I think, concessionally avoided rather than the point being forced, and it's taken quite a bit of investment on the part of a number of entities to get that capability actually doing what the standard expects. We're also seeing some developments in terms of surface testing methodologies for contamination. We're noticing overseas that there's some discussion about sewerage testing, and there are claims that the identification in sewage gives you a 4 to 5 day head start in preparing for an outbreak or a hotspot. I don't know how that's working. We're expecting it to come, but nobody's rung the phone for us yet. And there's been a lot of interesting work on the efficacy and the content of sanitisers. There's also been an upturn in the demand for PPE fit testing, and we haven't accredited anyone for that, but we've certainly answered a lot of calls about how often and how that might be effectively done. Next slide, thanks, Sam. So, questions. There was an earlier question about test methods where the test method is specified as internal to the lab and not to an established standard. While standards do exist, what level of confidence would the end user should expect? That's a fabulous question. I have had the same question myself. The answer would be that I think you as the end user have to take that up with the laboratory and say, what is this method? Why have you got an internal method? Internal methods may be established for a number of reasons. So if a standard offers you alternative pathways, the internal method will specify you will use pathway A. That now becomes an internal method, and so it has to be referenced. On the other hand, the internal method has no public scrutiny. It's not subject to public scrutiny, and I think it's absolutely worth a discussion with the facility to establish to what extent it maps onto the expected performances of the Australians of the relevant standard. Are there any other questions? Pulling down. Fit testing program includes train and accreditation. Good, thank you, Linda. That's for respiratory protection. Yes, that's good. I'm strongly supportive of that. It would appear to me that there's a big gap in the marketplace. We provide compliant PPE, but we never actually check that it's compliant when it's on the face of the user. Re-engagement, what part of the measurement process are you involved with? So there's a survey here, please. And I'm just trying to get some sense of where we go. I noticed the time is 1:55 and I'm on slide 26. I did think that was going to be a little hopeful. Let's see how we go. So how many of you are involved in the inspection, the upstream assessment of a site, the sampling, the measurement, the testing side of things, perhaps the calibration of equipment? I know some facilities have accreditation for in-house calibration. There may well be people who are spending a significant amount of their time in managing measuring equipment. Review of the outcomes, and then perhaps responding to the outcomes. So the review of the outcomes, I can see that as being coming up with a whether it's a significant number, and then responding, coming up with a plan for how that could be ameliorated or massaged to the practices could be massaged to improve the outcomes. Okay, so there's some involved in inspection. We have about 2/3 of the people through. There's a few involved in inspection, a reasonable number involved in sampling and measurement, a small number in calibration. Review of outcomes is the second biggest number, and then responding to those, coming up with a risk-based plan, a couple. All right, thank you. Moving on, let's have a look at using outcomes from accreditation. Samira, next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Before I go here, fake test certificates do exist. We have encountered crop, chop, paste places, particularly from overseas. I've said it already, a report is not a lucky charm. You have to read it to see that it is relevant and right for you. Next one on. So a few things to look at when you do see a test report, and this one's a report for a building product rather than something out of the OH&S domain, but the requirements are the same, the issues that you need to look at are the same. There will be a test method. There will be test results. In the margins somewhere there will be an accreditation standard and an accreditation number, the NATA endorsement, and possibly the ILAC logo. Next slide on. This is probably a reasonable time to say there are 180 odd other accreditation bodies around the world. I've thrown onto this slide a few of the more commonly known logos that you might see. You'll typically see these if you're importing equipment and purchasing accreditation activities, purchasing calibrated materials, and yeah, you can see A2LA, CNAS, SAC, SINGLAS, and UCAS. There will be that information. These entities all operate to the same standards and disclosures as NATA. They will all have, I know they all have high-end internet websites that allow you to identify the accreditation numbers and the accreditation capabilities of their facilities. Next slide, thanks. In order to join the ILAC family, these entities have to demonstrate there are regional entities underneath, so you can see APAC, the Asia Pacific Accreditation Corporation, the IAAC, the Inter-American Accreditation Corporation, a number of entities in the AFRAC, SADC and ARAC zones, and EA, the European Accreditation. Those regional entities are the level at which the mutual recognitions are established, and then on the basis of those mutual recognitions, an accreditation body is accepted into the ILAC family as a signatory. Next slide, thanks. So that process of mutual recognition is underpinned by mutual evaluation. I happen to be an APAC evaluator. The last evaluation I did was mainland China, and it was a beast. We took 13 evaluators for 8 days, and the Chinese gave us open access to all of their data, their staff, their assessors, their assessor records, the whole lot. They basically lay there and let us peer through the data that was available and go from there. We looked at a statistically significant number of those accreditations that they have issued. I was very comfortable with the level of performance demonstrated by CNAS. Underpinning mutual evaluation is that work for the 17011, the accreditation criteria, and then underneath that is common technical standards. Now, it's all very well having, let me just close that. It's all very well having standardized accreditation criteria in labs operating to 70025, but if the baseline technical standards are not equivalent, then there can be no equivalence in acceptance of the thing that matters, the test results, the inspection findings. So those common technical standards are absolutely critical. We are strong supporters of the ISO process because of the need for that commonality. Next slide. Now, I am going to run a little bit over time. I will try and slash through these pretty quickly. Buying tests or calibrations. John asked me to talk a little bit about things to think about when you're engaging with NATA accredited laboratories, and I figure that this could be set up for either a testing or a calibration component. So the key issue here is to know what you need. Why are you getting the work done? What are the standards and the codes and the specifications that are relevant? And what are the ranges that are relevant? If you're getting something calibrated, a multimeter or something like that, do you need to have the current and the voltage and the resistance all calibrated? Or do you only use this device for voltage? How well do you need to know? It's amazing how we we talk about being scientific, but we very rarely talk about how well do you need to know the information, because that has a direct impact upon how the method used, the precision around the method, and the confidence with which that number can be cast into the future, can be extrapolated into for a period of time. Set it up correctly on the supply side. Can the facility deliver what you are looking for? It may not be just a test or a calibration result that you're looking for. You may be looking for support in court. You may be looking for support in the explanation or the analysis or the understanding of what that number actually means. It may be that you're looking for other services as well. So, for instance, can you change the priority of test samples sent to the laboratory? NATA won't necessarily look at that, but sometimes the ability to push an urgent set ahead of the routine work is absolutely critical. These are things that you need to think about when you're forming that relationship with the testing or calibration provider. It's absolutely important that you think about the whole of that service. Accreditation should be a starting point for building that relationship, not the end point from which you go, well, they didn't do what I wanted. When you come to delivering this, deliver the goods safely and clearly. You'd be surprised how often environmental samples get all mixed up in the esky. You'd be surprised how poorly labelled many of these things can be. It's up to you as the provider of the goods for testing or calibration to do that safely and clearly. Go and have a look at what's actually happening in the field, and you, as the professional signing off on these things, might be absolutely horrified by the shoddy delivery that we see when we stand in the lab and look at what comes through the door. Next slide. The world has changed from when I started in testing. And when I started in testing, things were pass, fail, and trust me, I'm the test lab. These days, we're living in a probabilistic world. We have tons of data now. We can slice and dice that data, but thinking about testing and probabilistic approaches, how often do you need to get things retested? How often do you need to get things recalibrated? Long ago, when I joined NATA, there were guidance documents on calibration, and as I worked through NATA, those documents, staff came to rely on those documents and use them as the baseline. We've gone back to just releasing them as guidance documents. They're a starting point for the discussion about how often you need to recalibrate items, because you, as the equipment owner and user, are the only person that knows what that equipment is used for, how important the output numbers are, and how it lives in its box. What are the risks and the consequences of non-compliance? You, as the equipment user, determine that. So it's for you to think carefully about how often you need to set up calibrations, how often you need to set up measurements when you're dealing with time-based variations. I've got a fairly ordinary graphic there which shows a normal distribution trending upwards. When the median score finally goes outside the upper limit, it's more than 50% likely that the results are outside the limit. That's worth thinking about. That is why you're trying to manage calibrations by doing it more regularly, why you're trying to manage measurements by doing it more regularly, because there is a probabilistic dispersion of findings, and we don't talk about that. We don't think hard about that and what that implies for the measurements. Even today, regulators say, look, if it's under the number, it can go. But in that case, that red line, that red normal distribution there, if that's just fractionally under 49% of the time, there's a probability that it's actually not. It's actually the real value, the true value, is over the upper limit. Next slide. So when you get a report, read it critically. Note the comments, note the changes. Check what's relevant. Check the conformance statements. Cut and paste mistakes do happen, particularly on bespoke reporting. Reporting from LIMS systems, usually not, although I have tripped over a few where stuff that's been punched in by marketing cascades through into the report and doesn't actually provide the information you're looking for. Determine whether that report is fit for your use. It's for you to choose to use the report. Convey that information to the users. If it's a calibration report, then you're going to have to change spreadsheets that take the calibration factors into account, correction tables that are in the box, correction tables that are on the walls, replace and update the data files and the case information, update the instrument history and the performance graphics in your system, and only then do you update the calibration database with the next due. Make sure you've taken the information into your system before you go next due. That way, at least, the information in the system is current and up to date. Next one. So things that you could look at. Who's issued this report? Who is the issuing laboratory? Is the laboratory accredited? There should be an accreditation symbol on the report. Methods, identification of the items. Does that actually match to your item? I was in New Guinea some years ago, and the laboratory indicated that it identified a stuffed up job because the item that was described in the report that came back was not the item that they'd sent to the laboratory to testing. And it was only when they tripped over this that they tackled the truck driver and said, what happened here? And the truck driver said, well, I hit a pothole and the item you gave me bounced off into the bushes, and I found another bit and gave it to the lab so that they had something to test. And it was only by reading the report that that had become apparent. Look for comments and observations. Look to see that the report meets your understanding of the context in which it's been required. Next slide. I love that shot. That was a US Air Force KC-135, and it was on the ground after maintenance, and they'd had to do an internal hull pressure test. And in the process of doing the test, it went boom, and they blew the tail off it. When you look into it, there was a whole pile of things that went wrong to get to that point. Next slide, thanks. So, if you're going to do some measurements, it's worth thinking a little bit about measurements. What is the measurement that you need? What happens if it goes wrong? In that photo, there were barricades and exclusion zones. No one was hurt in the course of that failure. You need to measure to minimize variability, and you needed to measure to maximize confidence. In the case of that aeroplane, a handmade pressure gauge had been used, and it didn't have a stop at the maximum level. It wasn't possible for the operator, without watching closely, to establish that they had actually overpressurized the device. What factors were relevant to the measurement? Time? Absolutely. Force? The climate, well, it doesn't look like there was too much wrong in that climate, except that it's my belief, it doesn't come out in any of the reports, but it's my belief that the testing officer was distracted. He was talking to a mate as he was doing a routine pressure test. How was the measurement taken? Well, he had a piece of gauge, stuck it in, connected it up in accordance with the procedures, and pumped it up. There was nothing statistical about it. He didn't realise that the safety relief valves that are designed to prevent that had been locked shut in the maintenance process and had not been unlocked. The measuring equipment was not up to scratch. The technique to use, that was what the procedure that was described by the aircraft manufacturer. I don't know quite where the measurement, how that one would be reported, but quite clearly it was not good enough. If you're going to take any measurement, you need to look at these factors and ask yourself, what am I doing to give confidence that the measurement is good enough? Next slide. Now, if you've commissioned testing and it's not good enough, what do you do? Well, the facility is your first point of call. What is the issue? What is not the issue? It's fair to say, given that we are living in a probabilistic world, that sometimes expertise means being able to say, I can't tell you. We can't do that in that time frame. This is the best we can do with what we've got. I've had a couple of complaints this year already by disgruntled end users, recipients of testing and calibration services, who said, I don't know if it's a pass or fail because it's in that zone of uncertainty and the lab won't tell me it's a pass or a fail. And sometimes that's what the lab has to do because their own systems don't give any more confidence in the number than that uncertainty that they're quoting back to the end user. NATA is available to assist. If you have issues, we can investigate. We need a written factual basis to act, and we have a very strong preference that you talk with the facility in your first point of call and come to us only if you don't get an appropriate response from the facility. And the reason for that is that all we will do is go and talk to the facility. So better for you to hear it firsthand from their mouths rather than for you to have it secondhand interpreted through me. Next slide, and we're almost done. I'm thinking that we're looking at a fabulous time. At the moment, in the occupational hygiene domain, there's a tremendous amount happening with the Internet of Things. We're seeing the whole of the infrastructure that we work in being confronted by the new needs of this Internet of Things and the new data possibilities available to us. We're seeing changes happening in terms of water and energy consumption. There's a whole pile of hot new things talking about comms, energy, transport, the question about bioinformatics and automated artificial intelligence interacting with health and materials. We've seen changed information relationships. From when I went through school, where the trick was to find 2 or 3 reference texts and know them well, we now have to teach our children to understand, to analyze critically a volume of material that we never before had, to put that into context, to deal with these things in a statistical fashion. So this is a fabulous new world, and just about everything we've done in the last 50 years is going to be challenged. However, the issues around conformity assessment, around risk, around good governance haven't changed. It's just as likely under this new world that somebody will turn around and say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He has an interest in this outcome. This company would say that because they derive additional funding from the rectification, the cleanup. The issues around risk and governance don't change, and I think for that reason there will continue to be a market for accreditation into the future. Next slide, I'm done. I'm sorry that I've run 15 over. Are there any questions, people? Good. Thank you, people. It looks like there is no question. I did notice some discussion about the aerosol and method of fit testing, and I'm be keen to hear if there's anyone that could talk to that, if that's possible.
Julian, thank you for the presentation. I must admit, you did a good job in bringing a rather technical and dull subject to life. So well done. I think that we all remember the catch cry from your presentation when we next put our occupational hygienist hat. That is it good enough? It is assuring to know that an official NATA stamp means independence, some sort of guarantee with respect to competency and quality. It is refreshing to know that what NATA accreditation can't do, such as a preference of one technical solution or method to another, and the NATA accreditation can't really identify fraud or deceptive conduct. Good to know that NATA always keep relevant by the kind of accreditations relevant and applicable to occupational hygienists, including COVID-19 testing. So thank you again, Julian, and thank you, audience, for your participation. This presentation will now conclude.
Thank you very much, guys.